Hi everyone, you're listening to the Southasia Review of Books podcast from Himal Southasian, where we speak to celebrated authors and emerging literary voices from across South Asia. I'm your host, Shwetha Srikanthan, coming to you from Colombo, and my guest today is Mohamed Shafeeq Karinkurayil, joining us from Manipal to talk about his new book, The Gulf Migrant Archives in Kerala, Reading Borders and Belonging. Before we get started, I'd like to invite our listeners to check out Himal's Patreon program on our website, where you can pay to support our mission to give South Asian literature the spotlight it deserves. To make conversations like this possible, we need the support of our listeners like you. The realities of Gulf migration from Kerala is not lost on anyone, but the discourse around the cultural dimensions of labor migration remains invisible. In analysing the cultural records of Gulf migrants from Malayalam literature and visual culture, Shafeeq's pioneering book is an effort to salvage the migrant archive in Kerala. The book draws from a variety of sources to re-center migration as a lived experience that cannot be reduced to the economic role of the migrant alone or the passivity they have been accorded as victims of unjust labor conditions. In doing so, Shafeeq highlights migrant creativity and narratives of migrants' own condition as an attempt to factor them into the homeland from which they are away. Shafeeq, welcome to the Southasia Review of Books podcast, and thank you so much for joining us to talk about your new book.
Hey, hello. Thank you. Thank you, Shwetha, for this opportunity for having me here today.
Shafeeq, you write that Kerala and the Gulf became fantasy lands for each other's lacks. Gossip and rumor also plays a huge role in driving the fascination for migration to the Gulf. The harsh living and labor conditions of migrant workers were private affairs in Kerala for the longest time. As far as the public sphere was concerned, the Gulf was a source of remittance and community capital alone, or a place of miracles and overnight success. But there was a shift in the late 1990s that deflated this fantasy. So tell us about how you've highlighted these contradictions and aspirations in different forms of visibility of the Gulf migrant experience in the book.
Maybe I should begin with a story, which is, it's one of those stories which we hear from the village, which is that this Kerala migrant, Malayali migrant, I've used this word Malayali and Kerala interchangeably, so they are not really the same. So there is this Malayali migrant, and then he works in the Gulf, and then he invites his Arbab, this boss, sponsor, to come visit him in Kerala. So the Arbab comes to Kerala. He's treated royally, obviously. He's his boss. There is big car to take him to places, and he is taken to very beautiful places. The house itself is big. A lot of people seem to be working in the house, all of that. On the final day, the Arbab tells the guy, okay, now you don't have to come back. The idea being that now I will not be able to see you as an employee. He cannot understand why does this guy want to come and work there like a servant, a boy, an office boy. He is like a very wealthy person. Like he has car, and look all around, like everything is green. There's mango on the tree. There's jackfruit. There's papaya. Why will this guy come there? Why? It doesn't make any sense. Though not exactly like this, but it kind of indicates the contradictions involved in Gulf migration, which is that Gulf is this wonderland in the sense that it is not a wonderland in the sense that you expect it to be beautiful or things to be so pleasant there. Everyone knows that life in the Gulf is full of hardship, but at the same time, it can also translate to something really wonderful back home. Big houses, mansions, big cars, all of it, the ability to be benevolent with your resources, to demonstrate your largesse. These are things which basically subverts the kind of power structures which existed in the villages. So that is what Gulf gave. Now, unfortunately, the discourse around the Gulf has been, however, as if this hardship in the Gulf is a secret. That as if this hardship in the Gulf was never known to the Kerala public. Now, this is what I wanted to contest right from the beginning in the book. See, there are some assumptions that people make when they say that the hardship is not known to people back home, which is that as if this is a secret which is kept by the migrant and cannot be communicated to anyone else. Now, if you look at the feature of migration from Kerala, it is in the hundred thousands. It is also kinship based, and it is a chain of it's chain migration. It is not possible to keep these secrets, first of all, in the very practical sense. It would require such a conspiratorial mechanism to make this a secret, like, what is the actual job of this guy. In fact, there is a very different way of looking at it, which is that Gulf offers you a different paradigm of thinking about jobs, which is that if you are in Kerala, and this is the case even today, like even today you have people in Kerala who will pay lakhs of rupees to get a job which will, I don't know, I mean, if they work for 20 years, maybe they can get back all the money they gave as bribes. Like, and it's not called a bribe, it's called other names, but essentially, but what is the understanding of that job? I mean, this entire mechanism works on the idea that once you get into a job, that is your job. So your job is actually the end result of what you did in your life, or the kind of family you come from, the provenance that you come from, the kind of education you got. So your job is the final resting point. It's like this joke we have, like, if only I had a job, I could take some leaves. Like, in the sense that everyone is waiting for the job to happen because that is the final thing. After that, there's nothing. But Gulf actually, in its prime, not now, in the 80s, it gave you a different paradigm of looking at jobs, which is that your job does not define you. Your job is temporary. Today you may be a cook, but tomorrow you can be a cashier. Today you may be a driver, but tomorrow you can be some kind of a businessman. So basically what Gulf gave is this idea of new way of looking at jobs. So it's not as if people did not know how difficult it was in Gulf, but Gulf also promised immense mobility. Then the question is, then why is it that we treat these Gulf stories as if they are some kind of revelation? Why do the stories themselves present to us as if they are some kind of revelation? And the answer to that will have to be located both in the Gulf and in Kerala. And if you look at it in Kerala, there is a contradiction that comes into play, which is that the entire value of the Gulf lie in the fact that it gives you this sense of distinction. It gives you a lot of wealth. It gives you this ability to be the next big man in your village. But at the same time, it also does not give you a language of translating your migrant experience into an experience of labor. This entire idea of, so this is what it actually means, that we do not know what the Gulf people were doing, which is that the labor in discourse had to be hidden in order for the Gulf migrant as a rich guy, for that particular image to prosper, you had to invisibilize the labor. That does not mean that labor was not known. These are two different things. People knew it privately. Now, what do I mean by privately? They knew it in genres that were not considered the genres of public speech, which is that of trade union, which is that of realist novels, which is that of public demonstrations or appeals in newspapers, etc., etc. But people knew it as rumors. There are all these rumors about people, the kind of hardship which people face, and they were shorted in some desert, or people who found some treasure, etc., etc. So you had a discourse about the Gulf, you had a discourse about the labor in the Gulf, but they were essentially in the genres that would not be considered to be legible in a public domain. That is basically what I was trying to say. And in order to do this, in order to say what Gulf was according to the migrants themselves, because I did not want to read them as some kind of victims, as some kind of people who required rehabilitation because they were away for a long time. I wanted to look at their own productions, cultural productions, so the kind of literature they wrote, the kind of photographs they produced, or the films they made, etc. So this is what I have tried to do in the book.
And on the topic of photographs, while almost all mainstream narratives on the Gulf migrants present their lives as tragic, photographs show us a different picture. If before the turn of the century the Gulf was thought of in Kerala as fantastically rich, it's mostly due to the Gulf photos, as you write. And access to cheap photography in the late 1970s in the Gulf shifted migrants' representations of themselves based on labor to seeing the Gulf as a space of modernity and mobility and aspirations. So how did photographs become this record of Gulf migrant creativity, and also as a counter to other popular forms of representation?
Imagine you are in the late 1970s. There is not one film about the Gulf. Even if you were in, let's say, 1985, there was just one film about the Gulf. The only way you could see the Gulf in Kerala, like otherwise it's all just hearsay, right? The only way you could see the Gulf in Kerala was through these photographs. And there were hundreds and thousands of photographs. That is the point. Because this technology had become so cheap then. And these are simple cameras, right? I mean, there's no great sophistication required. These are just handheld point and shoot cameras. And migrants are taking photographs everywhere. But at the same time, there is a general regulation with the photograph, which is that we generally do not take photos of sad moments. So we take photographs of happy moments. Now this is given. So one does not expect photographs to be some kind of truthful archive of how life in the Gulf used to. But at the same time, what we see in the photograph is not generally happy moments, but it's actually a representation of the Gulf. Like it's a particular, I mean, there are particular ways of being happy. Not all happy people are alike. So there is this particular way of being happy in the Gulf. And that particular way of being happy in the Gulf was to show these huge buildings, or like, these cars, or like, tucked in shirts and shiny boots, and these telephones and televisions and radios. So there is a particular way of representing the Gulf in the 1980s, which in Kerala at that point of time could only pass off as fantasy, including the migrants from Kerala, including the Malayali migrants. So it's not as if for them there could be a realist approach to these things, these objects that they see around them. The only way to capture life in its everydayness in the Gulf, because of the sheer presence of these objects, was to turn it into a fantasy. Now I have a interesting story here, though it is not connected to photographs, it is connected to images, it is connected to film. And which is that, the first film which was shot in the Gulf, the first Indian film which was shot in the Gulf, in UAE, it was in UAE, and it was this Malayalam film called Vilkanund Sopnangal, Dreams for Sea. Now, in fact, before they had started shooting this film, and it was written by, and this is very important, this film is written by one of the tallest figures in Malayalam literature, M.T. Vasudevan Nair. He passed away a few weeks back. This person's story, and he is also an award-winning film director. Now, before they shot this film, the story of the film was that this film is going to be about a guy who goes to the Gulf, who helps everyone around him, but then is cheated by those very same people he helped, and he comes back home empty-handed. This was supposed to be the story. But when the film was shot, and when the film actually came out, the story was very different. It was about a guy who went to the Gulf, who began his journey as a very poor man, but became immensely rich, and he came back home with all that wealth, and he made a super house here. But then he understood that he still cannot win the love of his life and cannot still integrate himself to the ways of the family, and therefore decides to put his house on sale and goes back to the Gulf. Now, my own understanding of why the story changed would be that when you actually come face to face with the wonders of the Gulf, because at one point of time, initially the film shows all the low class migrant spaces of the Gulf, like very crowded dormitories, very narrow gullies, all of that. At one point of time, the film shifts to showing the airport, the Dera Tower, the Dera Clock Tower. There is this presence of a large architectural wonder that Gulf had become even then. And then my theory would be simply that, when you come face to face with this kind of wonder, there is no way you can really stick to your old story. And the sheer presence of the kind of opulence that Gulf is, makes us change the genre of the story, which does not happen today, by the way. And then when this film was released, even more interestingly, the film was publicized as a golden opportunity to see the Gulf. That is what the film posters said. So the idea is that when it comes to photographs, when the migrants had to locate themselves in the space of the Gulf, it could not be a realist way of looking at the Gulf. It can only be wonderful, which is not to say that it was fake. The way of reading these photographs are that the migrants see their own lives as wonderful, which is why even in the mid 80s, or even after, let's say, the film was released, Vilkanand Swapnangal was released, when the migrants fashion themselves in these photographs, they are actually borrowing their ideas from films which are set in the West rather than films which show some kind of difficult working class life in a city, which would be the realist way of putting it. But they wanted to see themselves as some kind of protagonist in a thriller film, protagonist in an adventure, in a fantasy land. So it tells us a lot about how the migrants saw themselves, their role in their own lives when they come in the presence of all these new technologies and new ways of arranging space around them. So that is the reason, and it's very surprising because migrant photographs, there are like thousands and thousands of photographs. They are hardly taken seriously in the sense that there has not been really any effort to looking at these photographs as archives of Gulf migration. They are invisible, and what I have tried to do is to visibilize some of these photographs. In fact, there is only one photograph in the book, but then I am describing a lot of photographs. But hopefully I have conveyed the essence of a lot of photographs in that space. Yeah.
Shafeeq, I hope someday you'll write more about these photographs. It's fascinating to hear. Also, for our listeners, we've recently actually published a piece by Anjana on M.T. Vasudevan Nair's work, so I would recommend our listeners to check that out as well. And Shafeeq, I actually wanted to talk a little bit more about the representation of the Gulf and Gulf migrants in Malayalam cinema. So as you've said, from the 1980s, they showed the Gulf as a space of fortune and fantasy. And in the 1990s, films take on a more realistic approach to the Gulf. So how has Malayalam cinema in its different forms, whether that's independent cinema, home cinema, translated this collective experience of Gulf migration?
So as I told you, like the first film to represent the Gulf as a space was in 1980. But then until the late 1990s, you don't really have any film just shot in the Gulf. Of course, there are many reasons for it, including the kind of restrictions which would be there, one assumes. So, what is interesting is that even when there was a lot of money which was poured into Malayalam cinema in the beginning, in the late 1970s, also primarily because of the Gulf migrants, people would rather spend this money shooting in places like, if you look at the high budget films which came in the late 1970s, early 1980s, except for this one film which was shot in the Gulf, you have films which were shot in the US, in Singapore, in England, in Japan. People would rather go somewhere else. But Gulf was there as a fact in these films, in the sense that you would often hear references to the Gulf. These references could be actually about someone being there in the Gulf or someone who has gone to the Gulf. But you would also have references, other ways of references. For example, a lot of reference to smuggling, in which it is understood that this smuggling is happening between Gulf and Kerala. Films which are set in these coastal areas, which feature smuggling, but then the Gulf is not mentioned, but it is kind of like it's common knowledge that if it is smuggling, it has to be gold or electronics from the Gulf. That kind of understanding is there. Generally, Gulf is understood to be a place where people finally escape. If you are in the Gulf, then you have arrived, let's say. See, interestingly, for example, Visa, another film which is majorly about Gulf migration, 1983 film. It has a migrant who is imprisoned for 3 months in the Gulf. But when he comes back, he is coming back with another visa to go back. Because it's understood that, it is, if there is a way out, it has to be in the Gulf. Interestingly, in the 1980s and in the 1990s, you will see many films which has failed migrants, in the sense that these are people who wanted to be migrants to the Gulf but did not succeed. And because of that, the story goes on. The understanding here being that, once you go to the Gulf, there is not much story left. It's understood that, you have made it big. This particular understanding changes in the late 90s. In the late 90s, you have stories of people who were in the Gulf and still remained poor and came back empty-handed. So, the story which, for example, M.T. Vasudevan Nair wanted to write in 1979, 1980, finally happened in 1998. In the sense that, if you look at the story of Gershom, which is a Malayalam film in late 90s, perhaps the first film to show a migrant who came back empty-handed. It's all about hardship in the Gulf. It's all about how people cheat in the Gulf. Then you have a film like Gaddama, which is like Help, which is about a Malayali migrant woman, a female migrant, who again, is exploited in several ways. And then the essential story here is that even after coming back, they do not find any support. This is the crux of the story. What is interesting, to keep the story short, is that if the story of the Gulf in the 1980s was about people, and until the second half of 1990s was about people who went to the Gulf, and therefore that is the end of the story. From the late 1990s onwards till now, you have a lot many Malayalam films which show the Gulf and which are about migrants. But what you will notice is that people hardly move up the social ladder. And this is the crucial difference between the Gulf in Malayalam cinema as it existed earlier and as it exists today. Because today, if you are a low-class migrant, the film will keep you a low-class migrant till the end. There is no escape anymore imagined with the Gulf. Which is also the reason why the stories can seamlessly go on to the Gulf from Kerala and come back. The reason being that Gulf today is not the kind of border it was at one point of time. Gulf does not give you the kind of mobility it did at one point of time. It is understood to be a continuum. It is understood to be contiguous with Kerala. And this is actually the death of the Gulf dream in a way. That does not mean that people do not migrate. People still migrate, and it has to do with what kind of opportunities are there back here, and also the kind of higher salaries that they receive in the Gulf. But it is not going to give you social mobility the way it did. It can make you richer, it can make you manage your finances better, but it does not give you the symbolic capital it once did to the migrants. So that would be the essential difference between, if you look at the way in which the Gulf films have progressed over time. In the book, I have analyzed, the kind of fantasy which was associated with the Gulf, looking at the comedy films, because, for them, in the comedy films, the Gulf was understood to be the enviable groom who will come and marry off your loved one. In fact, there is a film that I did not mention. I mean, I have not discussed in the book, but in the interest of our listeners who have read the book, I'll tell you another story, which is about this goldsmith who gifts a very, very expensive gold chain made of out of all the gold that he has scraped off his customers to his girlfriend. But then the girlfriend, on being presented with the prospect of getting married to a Gulf guy, suddenly acts like she does not even remember this guy, and then gets married to the guy. But then the guy decides to leave the Gulf, and that is the crisis point. And to spoil the film for your listeners now they are in real need of money because the Gulf source has ended, right? And then they turn to that very expensive gold chain and find out that it is actually fake. So, but it tells us about the what Gulfers assume to be like. If you are in the Gulf, there is money coming. The moment you are out of the Gulf, you are precarious, and this is why the Gulf people could not really translate their existence into Kerala, because the moment they present themselves as if they are any other laborer in Kerala, then there is no distinction left to them. Their entire distinction came from the fact that they are Gulf migrant, and Gulf promises you enormous riches.
Shafeeq, if you ever get the opportunity, I would recommend a Sri Lankan film called Passport, which deals with two migrant workers who try to go to Italy from Sri Lanka. And it's a very tragicomic story, and it reminded me a lot of the films that you just mentioned.
Incidentally, there is also a 1980 Malayalam film called Passport.
That's great.
Yeah, but it's about fraudulence. It's about people who cheat in the name of the Gulf.
So very similar experiences then.
Yeah.
And Shafeeq, in the 1970s and 80s, you write about how songs were one of the mediums through which personal experiences of life in the Gulf became a talking point. Popular song culture in Kerala itself was undergoing various shifts thanks to tape recorders, which you actually interestingly point out were first brought to India by Gulf migrants. So how did songs, cassette letters, personal letters, and telephone conversations exchanged between the Gulf and Kerala become this record of the era, and how did it unsettle the mainstream narratives about migration?
So, just to begin with a clarification, which is that I was just citing Peter Manuel on his book Cassette Culture. He begins with saying that it was the Gulf migrants who brought tape recorders to India, and that changes the entire sonic ecology of our music, because it used to be, if you look at Hindi film music, it used to be dominated by a couple, and dominated by Hindi film songs, and then how cassette culture changes everything. In my own book, I have looked at the kind of songs, cassette songs, telephone songs, which existed in the 80s, in that heyday of cassette culture, 80s to mid 90s. In fact, we all had cassettes till early 2000s, but in the heyday of these genres used to be the 80s. Songs are one of those genres that I identified to be a private genre in the book. In the sense that if you look at the songs, I remember one song. I'm not a great singer, but തെക്കേലെ അബുഗൾഫിൽ പോയി കുടുക്കിൽ പെട്ടതും പറഞ്ഞു അത് കേട്ടവൻ്റെ ഉമ്മ തല ചുറ്റി വീണു അത് കേട്ടവൻ. This is a song which came out in the 80s, and it's about an old woman who goes and sits at a tea shop. This old woman, as she sits there, she basically, it's like a center of all the kinds of gossips that are happening in the village. One of the gossips that she hears is about this particular guy Abu, who goes to the Gulf and who has been trapped there in some trap. And on hearing this, his mother has fainted, and basically, it's in a bad shape. Now she hears it in a tea shop. Now you see many things here, which is that already people are speaking about people getting into trouble in the Gulf. and it's already part of these songs. So it's not as if, I mean, this is one reason why I insist that, people always knew about the Gulf. It's not that people did not know it in a realist genre. People knew it in all these other kinds of genres. See, the songs provide us both points about the Gulf. Look at the first song, which is first of its kind song, which later came to be known as the letter songs. All of this happened because of tape recorder, by the way. I mean, the thing about tape recorder is that it can record, it can play as well as record. So, which basically gave way to a lot of the cottage industry of recording songs. Now, in the first song of letter songs, and there is a reason why it's called letter songs, essentially these are songs which are sung as if they are letters. So, there is a particular way in which you write a letter in the, I mean, like, we would learn in schools, right? Like, write an official letter. So, I mean, if you look at the lived cultures in Kerala, for example, when you write a letter, whether it is to the village officer or to your husband or to your wife, there is a formulaic way in which you have to start the letter. Ephraim Bohman, but to my most respected, whatever, wife, husband, whatever, to your knowledge, my name, writes, I hope everything is fine there, I am fine here. This is formula. Any letter you write, you have to write this much. And only then go into the rest of even if you are writing a letter to a village officer even today, the first sentence is this, that, to the most respected village officer, I, Shafeeq, writes. And then you write the rest of it. It's a formula. These songs followed that formula. So they would be in so this is how it begins. Like, to the my most respected husband, for his knowledge, I write, whatever. Then the rest of it. Now, the thing is, if you look at this song, it gives you both the points, which is that the wife is saying, we are losing our youth. Our baby is crying, asking for you. What is the point of staying away, staying apart? What is the point of this marriage if we are not together? Like, I can resist temptation, but I'm not an angel. All of that. And the husband is saying, and this is the counterpoint, he is not saying that, I long, oh my God, this is all. He is saying, but don't I send you money? Do you remember how poor we used to be? Do you remember how difficult our life used to be? So the songs provide both the perspectives. It's not as if the songs give you like a very rosy picture of the Gulf. It is all about the difficulties in the Gulf. Again, like, people were listening to these songs, but at the same time, it gives you the realist answer to why people are there in the Gulf. It is that, don't I send you money? Like, aren't things happening fine at home in the village? And for that, the migration had to happen. Now, this is the story of Gulf migration. It was never a one-sided story. It has always been a two-sided story. It has always been a contradiction. It has always been this coming together, this dialectic of suffering and of wealth. Any claim that it was one-sided, any claim that the migrants were giving a wrong picture of their life to the people back home, as if they are PR agencies of the Gulf countries, that is wrong. In the sense that it is simply wrong because one has also to consider where did they come from? Like, what was the life condition before getting into the Gulf? Gulf is often referred to as the land that fed us. It's actually a very symbolic thing because, ultimately for people from the very lower strata, their wage used to be food, nothing more than that. It is only within that one can understand. Of course, if you look at exploitation, if you look at all kinds of risk, Gulf exploits you. Gulf. There is all kinds of risk involved in Gulf migration, all of that. But the migrants are also giving an answer to why do they still endure. And I think that position also has to come into our academic literature, and that is what it's not a story of today, which I will say. The book is not about the Gulf migrants today. The book is actually about the Gulf migrants in the 80s, primarily 80s and 90s. So after the phenomenal success of these letter songs, we also had phone songs, and in phone songs, very interestingly, there are also representations of female migrants. So that's a very interesting thing. But phone songs are also relatively later, as opposed to, I mean, as compared to the letter songs. So in phone songs, so that is the thing. In letter songs, it always used to be solo, because in one song it used to be the letter by the husband, the other song would be a reply to it by the wife. In phone songs, you have this duet, like it's a phone conversation. So the guy speaks, the woman speaks, the woman speaks, the guy speaks. So it's a duet. But again, I mean, it would start with the word hello, and that is how you identify a phone song. The other thing is about letters. We have in the 80s, we have an oral culture associated with letters. I mean, it's not as if every letter is read privately. Letter is not a private medium. In fact, many people would write in the same letter. So you have one sheet of paper. So in that one sheet of paper, you will see many people writing. It's that kind of thing. Also, the letter is need not be addressed to one person alone. It has several parts which are to be read out to different people. So it is read out. So, it's not like you're passing the letter from hand to hand. There is a general public culture, but also can understand that there are private letters, especially between husband and wife. In fact, this coming of this husband and wife as a basic unit of family might have a lot to do with Gulf migration, because this is in the sense that it's not as if we had nuclear families before, but the idea that the wife is the closest person to you is something of this time. Because for example, it's you had letter songs even before. Letter songs is a late 19th century genre, but then it was not like a couple song. The couple became the basis of understanding, let's say, alienation, suffering, but also the kind of mobility of the Gulf, etc. in this period. Though, I mean, of course, it's a stretch to say that Gulf invented the couple. I'm not saying it. I'm not saying it in the book either. But at the same time, you will see that they are at least kind of concomitant. They happened at the same time.
Despite the history of Gulf migration for over 5 decades now, it's only towards the end of the 1990s that we have some voices in the mainstream Malayalam literary space on the Gulf. And we still don't find much literature by laborers about their experiences. In the book, you talk about how much of the literature produced by Gulf migrants are published in small-scale supplements by cultural organizations in the Gulf. A few established publishers like DC Books and Mathrubhumi are making these works accessible now. Krishna Das, founder of Green Books, is another important figure in bringing writings on the Gulf into the mainstream. But these works are also critiqued for their nostalgia for Kerala and their inability to speak about the realities of life in the Gulf. In the piece you wrote for Himal and in your book, you've referenced V. Muzaffar Ahmad, who says that the Malayali writers in the Gulf find themselves waking up to a river back home rather than the desert in front of them. Do you think this gap in published work is due to the hesitation on the part of the Malayali writers in the Gulf, or the lack of space given to them in mainstream Indian press?
What happened was that you have the literary establishment. Now, the literary establishment had many prominent writers who have experiences of migration. But migration is not their prime concern. When people write about migration, then it becomes, let's say, a genre, a particular genre. Now, this particular genre did not have representation in the mainstream press. So, even when there can be people who are big writers who have had experiences of migration, They are generally not writing about their migration experiences. Now, migration experiences usually became melodrama, which was not considered to be a very respectable genre in Malayalam. They are usually called Paingili Sahityam. Paingili, basically soap. I mean, it's not, it literally refers to a bird, but I'm saying translation would be soap. People used to write about Gulf experiences even in the early 80s. But as I have mentioned in the book, they were not really published in the mainstream press because of this particular hierarchy of literary taste. Now, this changes when in the late 90s, established writers like Babu Bharadwaj, like established cultural figures, start writing about the Gulf. That happens in the late 90s. And then they are often in the form of memories because it's always about a previous time. Now, what happens because of this genre is that it becomes too individualistic. It becomes about one person. It finds, as a genre, it finds it very difficult to kind of represent the collective life. Our particular idea of this migrant suffering alone without being able to communicate it to others is actually a legacy of this particular kind of memorializing the Gulf. Because, I mean, historically, the Gulf migrants, Malayali Gulf migrants, being so numerous as they are, has had very vigorous collective life in the Gulf. They had cultural associations right from the 70s. They used to organize stuff, they used to have film screenings, they used to have festivals, a lot of things happened. But that is not the kind of sense that you get when you read this literature, because these literature are about lonely individuals. But at the same time, it is still a welcome move in the sense that mainstream press hardly had any experience of migration. So this is kind of bringing into the mainstream, into the public sphere, the issues related with migration. Because until then, in the public sphere, the Gulf migrant was absent. It did not even exist. It is associated with a lot of things that is happening in the late 90s and early 2000s, including there being unions for Gulf migrants in Kerala. So essentially, it is about a time in which Gulf migrants are finding their voice in the publicly legible genres, like trade unions, like labor issues, all of that. You mentioned Krishna Das, and Krishna Das actually did a great service to the migrant writers because he established Green Books. And I mean, it was that publishing house which published Goat Days, Benjamin's Goat Days, very phenomenal success, which then leads to the other mainstream presses established long back, giving a lot of space to migrant writers. So, you have in the last, let's say, from the time of, in the last 25 years, you would have as many or double, as many, let's say, as many books coming out of Gulf migrants. But if you look at the period before that, nothing. For the period from early 1970s, let's say, the Gulf migration began, late 1960s. For the first 30 years, zero. For the next 25 years, you have like a sudden explosion of Gulf migrant literature. Another factor is that the Gulf migrant literature has not been able to be at the same pace, at the same step as the mainstream Malayalam literature. I mean, that used to be the case. But today, for example, you have all kinds of migrant fiction. Because earlier migrant fiction used to be like when you watch these early 80s films, which is that it's all about one person, he's growing up, all his travails, which is not the case anymore. Now you have, and it's all about migration, by the way, in those days. But what we have today, I mean, the most recent, I'm not speaking about, let's say, 2000 to 2015 or something, or maybe 2010 something, but most recently, you have all kinds of different kinds of genre happening within migrant. So that is like the new thing which has happened.
You also look at Benjamin's novel Adajivitam, Goat Days, and Deepak Unikrishnan's Temporary People as two important examples of borderland writing. Tell us about how you've analyzed both authors' approaches to translation and navigating identities in writing about the Gulf migrant experience.
One thing about Benjamin and Deepak Unnikrishnan is that if you closely read Benjamin's Good Days, even though it is about making a Gulf migrant's life story, it has some of these moments in which the narrative subverts itself. Though it wants to present itself as a realist narrative which was arrived at after interviewing the real life migrant. I mean, at least that is how the book put it. If you closely read the narrative, you can see that there are narrative elements which kind of shape this certainty, which then makes you feel as if this entire frame of interviewing a real life migrant is just a postmodern frame. It's just one of those ways of creative interference rather than actually relating a thing. Why I call it borderland writing is that, I mean, it's a particular understanding of the border which the book puts forward, which is about a space in which words have private meanings. Because if you look at the birth of novel as a historical category, the idea is that the novels came about in homogeneous linguistic communities, which is the reason why Amitav Ghosh, after writing his first novel, The Circle of Reason, when he was deliberating on the idea of petrofiction, also in relation to Cities of Salt, Arabic novel, he said that it's very difficult to write petrofiction because petrofiction does not share the homogeneous linguistic community which is supposed to be the premise of novels. So there is this understanding that we have that words are transparent, and then realist novels makes a world transparent that you can see it and you can see through it. You can really see as if you are there. There is no hidden things in this world. I mean, it's based on the idea of human being as someone who has the capacity to know. Now, the idea of border that I presented in the book has to do with this idea that in certain spaces, words can have private meanings. It does not mean it has double meanings. That is not the idea. The idea is that even though the word functions in a particular way, for those with a different experience, it can evoke private sentiments and private pleasures. So, border is basically this space in which words have not just communicative function, but also iconic function. Words standing for words themselves and not for its meanings. I mean, when you're reading a book, for example, you're translating it in your head, right? Like these words that you read in the book. You are not looking at it as if it's an image. You're looking at it as if it's a writing, right? That's how we can read. But at times, words can turn themselves into images rather than staying as words. And this is what Benjamin does, this is what Deepak Unnikrishnan does, but in very different ways. Deepak Unnikrishnan's novel has to be mentioned especially because he gets rid of one of the reigning ways of writing about migration, which is one person story with complete transparency. Deepak Unnikrishnan does not do that. The novel does not have any kind of coherence that way. It is not about one migrant. It is not even presenting a migrant as if we really understand the migrant. And it does not have all these very victim migrant. It has all kinds of migrants. Basically, what it does is to get rid of this way of speaking of migrants and introduce a new way of speaking of migrants. So in Benjamin, what I did was to look at one paragraph and to read it very closely, in which Benjamin is giving a dictionary of the words this Najib, the migrant protagonist, learned on his first day. I'm closely reading it to show that how in this particular way of writing, Benjamin produces a different layer in which if you have been to the Gulf, there is a different way of experiencing these words. Similarly, in Deepak Unnikrishnan's work, I am looking at his last chapter in which he does something, and I want to request our listeners to read the book because I'm not going to tell you, but he does a trick with what is written there. So please read the book and then you will see. And that trick, in order to really understand that trick, it's actually about words becoming icons rather than communications, rather than myths. And there you have instances of border building. And all of this is to come back to the idea that in migrant writing, you will see this contradiction or this dialectic between having to be distinct but at the same time having to translate their life into universal intelligibility. And it is caught in this contradiction. Benjamin is caught in this. I mean, Benjamin's work tries to play out, not resolve, sorry, play out this contradiction. Deepak Unnikrishnan's work tries to play out this contradiction. That's what I've tried to do there.
For our listeners, in the book, Shafeeq, you explain the trick that Unnikrishnan has used in the book really well. So I would suggest listeners to check that out as well. And Shafeeq, I also want to talk about Khadija Mumtaz's 2007 novel Barsa. As you explain in the book, it's about the protagonist Sabita, a Muslim convert and gynecologist working in Saudi Arabia. And the story essentially follows her defiance towards misogyny and the gender-based injustices around her. Tell us more about this novel as a piece of migrant writing offering a women's perspective. And are there any other notable works by women migrants or the women left behind in Kerala offering this perspective?
This is a very interesting novel, Parsa, by Khadija Mumtaz. Essentially, the general response to it has been that it's feminist writing and that it is against Islamism. Now, because, fundamental Islam, because it is set in Saudi Arabia. But at the same time, this reading comes at an expense, which is that the cost of this reading, the price that one pays for this reading, is to not see that actually it's also a migrant experience. It is not a simple story of fundamental Islam versus liberal Islam. It's actually also about a Malayali Islam as opposed to a Saudi Islam. So the novel is about a woman who is at the intersection of a lot of marginal identities, who is suffering. It's the interlocking of a lot of marginality in one person. First thing is that she is a woman. She's a newly Muslim convertee. Someone who has converted to Islam. What she sees in Saudi Arabia is not the Islam that she converted to. That is the thing. So she's a woman, first of all. So being in Saudi Arabia, so many things are required of her, like covering her head, for example. It is not really covering her face, though that is. It's actually about covering her head. And then, where can one be? Who can one talk to? All of that. So there is that question of woman. But that is not all that there is. There is the question of being a brown person as opposed to being an Arab. So there is that oppression, she will not be treated on par with, let's say, an Egyptian or a Syrian because she's from India. On top of that, there is also the fact that she is from India, who does not belong to the Urdu world, because Urdu would be associated with Indian Muslims, but she is a South Indian Muslim. She's a Malayali Muslim, and then she finds it difficult to read Urdu, while it is understood that if you are a Muslim from India, then you should know how to read Urdu. So she finds herself at the intersection of all these different difficulties, and it is from that point that she tells her story, which makes it a very interesting read, and also it's a very good historical record of Saudi Arabia in the 70s and 80s. So, many historical incidents are referred to there, but we also see a time in which people can get citizenship through marriage, etc. So, it's not the time as it is today. There are, of course, other books. For example, in the book I have referred to Sonia Rafiq's Herbarium, which is also a very different take on migration. There is a woman at the heart of the story, but it's not like a book giving a woman's, but it is a woman's writing after all. One has to mention the kind of pioneering work that Leela Gulati did with narrative of those women who were staying back in Kerala with their husbands in the Gulf. recently, I think there are more works. Recently, this book came into my attention of Tamil migrants, three Tamil female migrants to the Gulf. It's called Unmoved by Ramachandran Usha. But that is basically, I have looked at Parsa as a woman's writing in the book, yes.
You've made this great observation in the book on how Kerala's modernity is built on the aspirations of a life elsewhere, stressing the importance of seeing the Gulf as a cultural force and Gulf migrants as agents of community building and change back home. So, what are the main challenges and takeaways from your own research for the book in building, translating, and carrying forward this archive of Gulf migration?
What is modernity after all? Modernity is this way in which you find yourself strange and to be able to experiment on oneself, right? And if you look at that, the the avenue for the youth of Kerala to discover themselves and to explore the world was outside. Like I mentioned before, when it comes to job, when it comes to self-expression, when it comes to malleability of the body in the photographs, all of it had to happen somewhere else. Now, what happens when we convert this to an archive today? That is your question. What happens when, in retrospect, to if we do the job of a collector? So, as part of the launch of the book here in Manipal, we had an exhibition which exhibited many of these photographs, but also some old passports, for example. Passports of migrants who went to the Gulf before UAE was formed, when it used to be crucial states. The visa was granted by the British High Commissioner in Bombay in order to go to the crucial states. You have all these stories, and the exhibition was a great way of bringing these forgotten times into the consciousness of the contemporary time. But at the same time, what happens to the archive when we archive it? And I think in order to really give this idea of, in order to really communicate the kind of mobility that was imagined in photographs, let's say, it depends a lot on the researcher, on the archivist, to give it life. Because the photos in themselves, what are these photographs? Photos in themselves do not say anything. It really requires someone to recreate the magic around those photographs. Because today what are these? Some old television, some old radio, some outdated technology. But what it meant at that point of time really requires you to be a storyteller. Because it's like stories can activate any fantasy land. It can build all those places for you, right? It requires that kind of effort on the part of the researcher, and it is actually a question of whether how much, to what extent can we do it in academics. But that is what the archive demands of us, and I think to a small extent I have tried to be a storyteller in my book. I hope I hope the readers also find it that way and also appreciate it.
Absolutely, Shafeeq. You've done a brilliant job in conveying these stories to the readers in the book, and I really appreciate what you've done there.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today and sharing your insights with us. It was a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Shwetha.
Thank you for listening to the Southasia Review of Books podcast from Himal Southasian. This episode was edited by Ritika Chauhan. If you like this episode, please share widely, rate, review, subscribe, and download the show on your favorite podcast apps. You can find the links to subscribe and listen to previous episodes on our website at himalmag.com. And while you're at it, please do also check out Himal's State of Southasia podcast, hosted by my colleague Nayantara Narayanan, featuring conversations on pressing social and political issues from across South Asia. What we do and what we love doing at Himal is really looking at South Asian literature like no other, and that gives us a very unique community, viewpoint, and the privilege of making conversations like this possible. So if you'd like to help us out, please do become a paying Himal patron. We have a great program with lots of perks, including Himal's iconic right side up map, and we'll welcome you to a fantastic Southasia review of books community. Thanks again, and until next time.